of the Phoenix, a Fairy Tale. Written by Avalon Roselin, with illustrations by R. Hamlin. Snow rifled through his satchel for the third time that evening. All of his few personal possessions were contained within. A change of clothing that was quickly becoming too small for him, a wooden training sword that was more notch than blade anymore, and a cluster of tiny, dried red flowers that had appeared at his doorway the morning before last. It was the flowers that he reached for to examine again. He was careful not to crush their delicate petals in his grip. There were several, and some far older than others. Clearly they had been collected over a long period of time, which left him with more questions than answers. The flowers were obviously important to whomever had painstakingly gathered and preserved them for years, so why would they be dropped unceremoniously at his door? Unless, he dared allow himself to believe, it had not been without ceremony or meaning. The little red flowers were aster. He had looked them up in a botanical book while studying in the palace library the previous evening. They were common enough in bouquets as filler, but the book led Snow to believe that a collection solely of red asters could mean only one thing. My heart is devoted to you. Snow had almost laughed at the juvenile way his heart skipped a beat when he'd read that meaning. He ought to be the one leaving gifts of devotion before he went away. For 3 years he would leave the palace to study the chivalric code, battle strategy, and languages at Northgate Tower. It was an advanced course of study, but one that would prepare him for a place in the royal guard, a place beside the one he hoped had left the flowers at his door. Tucking the asters away, Snow picked up the stalk of ambrosia he had plucked from the fields outside the town gate that morning. The leaves were already starting to wilt, but would hopefully perk up when placed into a vase. The yellow flowers were hardly noteworthy, growing in great batches by the roadside, but Snow hoped, if his hunch was correct, that the person who had left the asters would understand their meaning too. If not, if he was tragically wrong, he could simply claim they were a parting gift with no greater meaning. Not for the first time, Snow wondered the age of the oldest aster in the bunch. It had faded to nearly brown, its petals paper-thin and brittle. Could they be 6 years old, as were the first feelings of affection that had bloomed in his own heart? He had been 9 the first time he met the royal era, though he hadn't known who they were at the time. He'd only known that he had been walking around a hectic market square, quite lost himself, when he'd stumbled across a crying child. Her bright hazel eyes, shining with tears, were the first thing Snow had noticed. Those eyes had drawn him in, beckoned him to ask what was wrong. Through heavy sobs he'd gotten the full story. The child had become excited by the market and ran off from her parents' carriage, and when A realized what A had done, A'd kept running for fear of punishment. A'd gotten himself lost, and promptly decided A would accept whatever consequence awaited him if A could be safely returned. Snow had held her hand and led em back to the center of the square. Royal guards had swarmed and shut down the busy fair, to the ire of the merchants. The citizens of the empire had held their purses and babies close and kept their heads low as soldiers barked orders and searched homes. On instinct, Snow had known who they were looking for, and marched right up to the tallest of the guards to return the lost child. He had been struck hard on the back of the head and lost consciousness before he landed on the ground. He had woken up later within a carriage, which had hurriedly jostled its way back to the palace. He had lain in the other child's lap, those beautiful hazel eyes looking over him with worry and determination as gentle hands caressed his aching head. It was then that Snow had first started to tumble toward love for the royal era of the shining empire. Now, 6 years later, on the verge of his 15th birthday, Snow wondered if the other had harbored those same feelings just as long. A would have had to keep it secret for fear of harming Snow, as had happened that day. The royal family were perfect, untouchable, pure beings. By simply holding hands, Snow had threatened to sully the heir's piety. He was not even permitted to know their name. Yet the heir had demanded Snow stay in the palace and be brought up as a squire to Lady Arginham as his reward for his act of service. Snow had held no objection, being an orphan and likely bound for a life on the streets of the bustling capital. Life in the palace had not been easy, restrictions and rules beaten into him figuratively and literally over the years by his lady, but it was the only life that afforded him the occasional glimpse of the era as A lounged in the gardens or drifted through the library. There had been rare moments, secret, hidden moments, where the two passed in hallways and nearly brushed against each other. In those moments it had taken all of Snow's willpower not to reach out and hold her hand again, or bring those soft fingers to his lips to kiss. At last, after years, Lady Arginham had seen fit to send Snow to school to be a knight himself. He would be Sir Snow in 3 years' time, though not even a knight would be permitted to be a companion to one of the royal family, not the way he dreamed. Snow twirled the ambrosia stem between his fingers. He was probably being ridiculous, to think one such as the heir remembered him. Yet he found himself unable to put the thought out of his mind until he did something. His heart was loud in his ears as he slipped out of his room, nodding to the night guard that he had already bribed to keep silent about his excursion toward the nobles' chambers. Being in the heart of the shining empire, the palace was far more than a place where the royal family dwelt. They constantly played host to a number of visiting dignitaries, nobles, and ambassadors from around the world. These stayed in the richest part of the palace, far from the servants' quarters, where they could enjoy the sumptuous gardens and grounds at their leisure. There were other delights held within their chambers as well, Snow knew, but he had never thought of them. After all, the heir was only ever visible to him in the garden. The existence of the garden again made him question his foolish theory. The palace grounds were home to all manner of unique plants, their care a favored pastime of the Empress. Emissaries from foreign lands brought their most exotic and lush flowers to curry her favor. If the gift was from the heir, it would not be something so common as an aster. Unless, "My heart is devoted to you," was the intended message. Snow made his way across the gardens as stealthily as possible, lingering in the sweeping shade of the willows and ducking behind fountains that were twice his height. He had not told the guard who he was going to see, only that he had business on this side of the palace. Few questions were asked. Snow was known to be handsome and much sought after by the other servants, and it was not unheard of for a noble to request the discreet company of palace staff on occasion. Snow had never indulged their whims, but the guard could be forgiven for assuming a young man about to leave for some time would wish to be a little reckless on his last night in the palace. And the guard would not be wrong. Snow had been careful for years, knowing one mistake could end his tenure at the palace and separate him from his love forever. That was still true, but it felt like a bigger mistake to leave without expressing his feelings at all. Snow did not make it through the garden before he was halted by the sound of quiet sobs. "Go," his heart urged him, begged him. "You will not get another chance." Gripping the ambrosia tight and gritting his teeth, Snow turned his feet toward the sound of crying. He may be caught now and whipped for insubordination and lose his place in Northgate Tower, and Lady Arginham would be so disappointed, but he would not leave someone to suffer alone in the dark. The moonlight revealed a figure dressed in dark blue, the color of mourning. They sat slumped over a marble bench, head laying on folded arms, shoulders rising and falling with great heaving sobs. "What is the matter?" Snow asked, trying to sound confident, like he was supposed to be on guard duty in the regal gardens, despite being only a squire. The weeping figure turned, and hazel eyes shimmering with tears met his own. Snow lowered himself to one knee immediately, hands clasped above his head, the ambrosia forgotten on the ground.
Forgive me, your highness. I did not know.
It's you. Snow could not help but look up at the soft voice. The Era had stood and approached him cautiously, as if he might disappear. A reached their hands forward, and despite himself Snow took them in his. Before he could stop himself he had kissed each of their fingers. A sharp gasp halted him, and he released the Era's hands, lowering his face so A did not see how red it had become.
I am so sorry, your highness. Truly, I do not know what came over me,
Snow stammered. Instead of pulling away, Snow felt those gentle hands settle onto his shoulders. Then, all at once, the Era was kneeling before him, their foreheads nearly touching as they stared into each other's eyes. The tears had not yet stopped, and Snow could not resist the urge to wipe them away. His hands lingered on the Era's face, and the Era moved their own to mimic the gesture, cupping Snow's face in kind. Their hands were impossibly soft, as if they had never held anything rougher than the aster petals. Their lips were just as plush, never chapped, never cut during a training exercise. Snow had enough control not to kiss them, barely, and mostly because he worried his own lips would be somehow too coarse. The Era leaned forward until their foreheads did touch and let out a sigh. I was afraid I would not see you again before you left, and now you're here. I must be dreaming.
If you are dreaming, then we are having the same dream, Snow answered.
The Era drew back, clutching the folds of their robe shyly. Beneath the blue fabric, Snow could see the frayed edges of an old traveler's cloak and a worn leather bag. I had thought to follow you to Northgate in disguise and join you in your studies there, A admitted. I was not brave enough to leave the garden. Snow picked up the ambrosia from the cobblestone pathway, though he did not stand. He stayed on his knees, head bowed once more, and offered the flower.
It is bravery that brought me to the garden, your highness.
The Era lifted the flower into their own hands and rested the petals against their palm. The smallest of smiles graced their lips. Out of all my stepmother's magnificent blooms, you present me with this humble weed?
Humble, yes, and earnest,
Snow said. He dared raise his head to look upon the Era again.
A perfect match for asters.
Their smile bloomed as brightly as the flowers. I'm glad you received them, and you understood. A brought the ambrosia to their lips. Yes, you must have, and this surely is a dream. A clutched the flowers then to their heart and spun himself in a joyous circle, landing soundly in Snow's arms as the squire at last rose to meet him.
Let us not wake then, Snow murmured,
and held the Era closer than he'd ever imagined he would be allowed to. Of course, he was not really allowed to. If anyone else were to find them in such a position, he would be not only whipped, but imprisoned for life in Underkeep, the infamous dungeon where the worst criminals were held. It would be worth it to hold the Era in even 1 second's embrace. The Era frowned. Dreaming or no, dawn comes to steal you from me. A looked skyward, then excitedly pointed to a bright star. Look, the wishing star is shining. The divine phoenix is watching over our union. A smiled at Snow. Let us make an oath, so these long years will not separate us.
I will swear whatever you wish me to swear,
Snow answered, finding the star with his own eyes. I swear, the Era began, then shook her head. No, that's not good enough. A took a breath and restarted. I, Solace, of House Granyagal, promise myself, heart, body, and soul, to Sir Snow, until the end of eternity, and every moment before and between and after. I wish only to be yours, if you will have me. And I, Snow, promise myself to Era Solace, from the beginning of time to the end of eternity, I wish only to love you, Snow answered without hesitation. Solace placed her hand upon Snow's cheek again, and he returned the gesture to look fondly upon the Era. Solace smiled without reserve, the sparkle of starlight in her eyes instead of tears, as they leaned in. And we shall secure it with the most powerful seal of all, true love's kiss. Their lips met with eyes closed, so neither of them saw the star above twinkle. Thank you for listening to the first half of The Eye of the Phoenix, a fairy tale, written by Avalon Roselin with illustrations by R. Hamlin. If you are interested in reading the full version of the story, you can download it now in ebook form for free on Ko-fi and itch.io. Links are in the description. These audio adaptations are made possible by your support. By liking this video, subscribing to the channel, or offering a donation or membership to the Ko-fi or Patreon of Roselin Books, you will help more of these videos and audiobook files be created. Thank you very much, and keep growing until next time, Rose Garden.